from Finland to all of you around the world, and a very warm welcome to join this People and Purpose podcast. How very exciting to kick off the very first episode of this brand new podcast, which is dedicated to exploring the intersection of work, culture, and purpose across the globe. In each episode, we get to visit a new country and we get to meet a purpose-driven leader. My name is Tarja Takko, and I am the CEO and founder of Takko Advisory, and I am the host of this podcast. The first episode is focusing on Australia, a nation known, I think, first of all, for its beautiful beaches, but also cultural diversity, work-life balance, and innovation. I'm very happy to introduce my guest, Reianna Vercoe, who is driven by a clear sense of purpose and innovation. Let me introduce Reianna a little bit. Reianna is a recognized expert in Australian payroll and HR processes and trends with over 20 years of experience in HR software solutions delivery across multiple industries. Reianna is a product management expert, and she has also completed postgraduate studies in HR and organizational culture, offering thoughtful insights into the complexities of people management. In addition, Reianna is a long-term part-time small business investor and mentor, bringing first-hand knowledge of how HR strategies play out in both large organizations and smaller growing ventures. I asked from an ex-colleague of Reianna, how would he describe her? And this is what he said. Reianna is a very purpose-driven leader, and she lives to make the world more special. Reianna is inspiring, caring, and warm as a person and as a professional. What she does with very high ambition and very high expertise. Reianna, warm welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Thank you for starting this podcast as well.
Exciting. Let me ask you a first question. Can you share a bit about your journey and what drives your purpose as a leader?
I was thinking about this one when you'd asked me one time previously. And I thought, I probably won't go professional for this answer because actually I have a pretty distinctive name. So if anybody wants to know anything about me, they'll be able to find it on LinkedIn pretty easily, or you could just shoot me a message. I'm always happy to answer. A couple of years ago, I did an exercise through a very interesting thought leadership company we have here in Australia called Mojo. And it was basically talking about the first memory that you have of anything from your childhood. And I thought, oh, this is going to be really terrible because I actually have a really terrible memory. But when I did it, it was actually it was easier than I thought. There were two things that I remember. One was I did a school I'm going to say I was about 11, but my memory's not that great. And I did a school project about India. So this was a long time ago as well. It was way before you could just sort of photocopy things. So I remember very painstakingly tracing lots of pictures out of an atlas and basically putting together this huge block of wood covered in tinfoil. I'm sure my mum was thrilled. Covered in tinfoil with lots of pictures of people in Indian dress and facts about India. And I asked my dad to drive me to school with this huge board covered in pictures of India. And of course, I got a big fat A for that project, and everybody really loved it. And it did make me think, part of my own purpose, and it is still now, is I do like to feel like I'm part of something special, and I like other people to feel like that too. So I do like to basically create a narrative that inspires other people and brings everybody along for the journey. So that's always been something that motivates me and is core to my own purpose. Probably looking specifically at technology. So we mentioned I've worked in the technology industry for a long time. One of my other early memories is we got our first computer at school. This was also when I was about 12. I remember when it arrived, I stayed back after school, actually, so I could play with it. I remember thinking, this is just the coolest thing ever. And isn't it going to change so much about everything, even when I was 12? So that's also pretty core to things because one of the things I like to think about that is I recognize that it's a really great piece of technology, but it's probably more about what it enables rather than in and of itself. It's a fantastic thing.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. If you then start digging deep into Australia. And if we start by looking at the Australia's diverse cultural identity and its influence on the workplace, Australia is home to people from over 200 countries with nearly 30% of the population born overseas. And I think it's over 300 languages that are spoken in Australian homes, making it one of the most multicultural nations globally.
Yeah.
How do you see, how has Australia's cultural diversity shaped your leadership style and approach to work?
So if we think about, just to recap a couple of those, nearly 30% of Australia's population born overseas, and most of the growth we have in Australia from a population perspective, there's about 27 million people in Australia, so it's not a huge country, is very largely driven by migration. So what that means from a leadership perspective is that you'll be dealing with teams of people who are from very diverse cultural backgrounds, a lot of different, effectively there are large numbers of people where English is potentially their second language, a large spectrum of religious beliefs. You've got a lot of different, essentially, demographics who are all represented in the workforce at once as well. So that's the median age of the workforce in Australia is 38. And we have a retirement age in Australia of 65 as the official retirement age. The average retirement age is in the late 50s now, but it's steadily rising to match the legislated rate as well. So in any team, you'll have a mixture of older people, then you'll have Gen X's, millennials, and then we have Gen Z's coming in after that as well. And you'll have teams that'll be comprised of all of those at the same time across a lot of different industries as well, which is obviously a consideration as a leader. Diversity is so that effectively, and that will impact every industry in Australia, is that you'll have very diverse teams. So what that means from a leadership perspective is that you've got to be good at managing relationships, expectations, creating an inclusive environment so that everybody can come along for the ride. So it's part of your role as a leader to create a narrative that everybody can buy into. One of the other things that's interesting about being a leader in Australia, I remember last year I was traveling to Korea and I was on holiday, but we had a really important project going on. So I was speaking to my leader and I spoke to him and I called him by his first name. And I was with some other Korean people and they were like, oh, it's amazing that you refer to your boss by his first name. And I was like, well, yeah, sometimes other names as well, like kind of depends on the day. I thought that was really funny and kind of confronting as well, though. But it kind of highlighted that one of the strengths of Australia that you mentioned before, very laid-back culture. One of the challenges, very laid-back culture. So it can be quite difficult to connect people to success. There's a real lack of hierarchy. One of the benefits of a hierarchy, we don't really think about hierarchies as having benefits that often, but one of the benefits of a hierarchy is that it can be pretty clear from a career pathing perspective. So basically I'm in this office here and next I'm going to be in that office over there and then I'll be in that one over there. It's, there's a kind of an established norm that you're working towards in a more traditional kind of hierarchical environment, but that's not necessarily the case when you're in an Australian workplace with a more diverse sort of crew of people. So you have to work harder to understand what an individual considers to be success and to sort of communicate with them how their contribution is contributing to team success, as well as how they're becoming more successful within the business as well. I'm personally also a pretty process-driven leader, and that's a direct result of the other things above as well. So if you're going to have a fair environment with a lot of different people in it, and one where everybody understands what their contribution should be and how we measure success for the group, you have to have a lot of tooling in place in order to keep everybody understanding all of that in an everyday way as well. So without the right kind of tools and communication processes in place, the cat herd can start to expand quite quickly. So you've got to kind of bring it all down.
Yeah, so having that clarity and having that inclusivity is key, what I'm hearing from you. And I think it was a really interesting example that you shared from Korea, which I think is quite different, thinking about the culture and now comparing to Australia. But if we also talk about the work-life balance, I think that is one of the strengths also in Australia. I think the country is consistently ranking high in the work-life balance, with average is it 15 annual public holidays and a very strong emphasis on leisure time. And according to this OECD Better Life Index, Australians report above average levels of life satisfaction. How do you see this rich multicultural diversity impacts the positive work-life balance in Australia?
Australia does have some well-known, and for better or worse, depending on the perspectives, some very entrenched and highly regulated industrial relations, a very highly regulated industrial relations framework in Australia. It's managed by a government agency with a fair impact on business and work in Australia. So highly regulated and something that all employers are kind of bound by and constitutionally enshrined as well. So Australians work 38 hours a week. Anything beyond that is considered to be overtime. We have comparatively to many other economies, we have a very high rate of minimum pay, which is also enshrined across all industries. So we have a minimum, and then specific industries will have a specific amount of pay that they have to pay for particular kinds of jobs. So that is also regulated, as well as we have the more typical kind of individual or negotiated group agreements between employees and employers as well. So all of that contributes to, we do have a very highly regulated environment in which people are guaranteed minimum amounts of pay and minimum conditions within which they work. There's always challenges to that structure. From a business perspective, it can be quite difficult to calculate like correct entitlements within that. So it does put quite a lot of impost on business, which is a constant source of friction. As well as that, wage growth comparatively to other economic factors can be relatively sluggish, which causes a lot of friction as well from an employee perspective. So minimum wages are indexed every year, and inflation can rise at a much faster rate than that, which creates a bit of a sense of friction between wages are not going up, but the prices of everything are. Particularly in the last couple of years, Australia has had, like many other developed countries, some cost of living pressures, which have kind of exacerbated that, particularly amongst women and some other marginalised groups as well.
This actually it's a good bridge to the next topic, looking a bit about the challenges in Australia, and that's related to the workplace equity and well-being. The gender pay gap in Australia is currently approximately 13.3% as of recent data, with women earning less than men on average, which is quite a gap. Also, women occupy only about 32% of key management positions in Australian businesses. From your perspective, Reianna, what are the most pressing equity challenges in Australian workplaces?
I think you beat me to it. You just summarised a couple of them there. But yes, we do have a 13% gender. I'll talk about kind of at a macro level what the broad equity challenges would be, and then some of the recent kind of survey trends and how they reflect what's happening in particular cohorts of the market as well. So yeah, from a gender equity perspective, we did start some new regulated reporting of gender pay values. It wasn't widely done before a couple of years ago, but now we're basically increasing the number of employers who are part of a mandatory reporting program. So getting a bigger picture of the gap between gender pay in Australia. May 2024 was when we had the most recent changes, and it is expanding the number of employers who need to report exactly what the gender pay gaps are in their business. Probably more important than that, like getting away from kind of the macro, it's a 13% gap. There is actually also a growing gap in, so Gallagher end of last year did a pretty comprehensive report of workplace wellbeing in Australia. So about 2,500 respondents. And that kind of indicated that the importance of remuneration to employees has increased, and the level of satisfaction with that remuneration is decreasing, and that gap is getting quite wide. And for women, it's getting a lot wider, actually. So essentially, people think remuneration is more important than it used to be, and their level of satisfaction is lower. So we're starting to get a widening gap year on year in that space, and women are actually worse. So the gap is getting worse all the time. So gender pay gap aside, we do have an issue with women's in general participation in the workforce is under threat from the fact that those gaps are widening, and we're not really sort of taking any strong initiatives, I think, from a government perspective to address that. A lot of it is actually put back to the employer themselves and part of their own sort of internal initiatives, as opposed to anything government sponsored at this stage. Probably the second one I'd go to from there would be there's in general a lack of diversity in leadership positions in Australia. There was a report, I'm going to say it's about 3 years ago now, that very famously identified that there are more gentlemen named Andrew than women in the ASX 200, which is essentially the benchmark stock exchange in Australia. So that made a lot of headlines. The idea that there are more men of one name than there are women in the ASX 200 was a bit of an eye-opener. And actually, those numbers appear to be getting worse. So the number of women in ASX 200 companies and leadership roles is reducing. I think we do have a kind of a systemic issue where the way we evaluate somebody's suitability for leadership roles is pretty consistent across the board. We don't allow for a lot of sort of different paths to that kind of role, which in general presents challenges from people from a lot of different groups in entering those particular spaces. Probably the third biggest challenge is mental health is a very significant focus in Australian workplaces, despite the fact that we have high levels of work-life balance, as you mentioned, and a lot of regulation around pain conditions at work. We still have some gaps in supporting employees who face mental health challenges. A lot of people in Australia are employed in traditional industries, so there's a lot of stigma around mental health, and there's a lot of accessible support systems, especially in regional areas where a lot of the traditional industries are based.
So quite a few challenges, and also what was a bit maybe alarming was that you mentioned that the gaps are getting wider instead of actually seeing that there is going to be improvement in these areas.
Yeah, actually, interestingly, specifically in mental health, that gap did get quite a bit bigger, despite there being a fair amount of discourse, public dialogue about the impact of mental health and wellbeing at work. Those gaps are also getting bigger. So last year, the Gallup report identified about 63% of employees not satisfied with mental health and wellbeing policies, and about 10% of people have resigned due to wellbeing issues at work, which is quite high and getting higher. So we do have a bit of an issue from a leadership perspective. I personally would encourage that it's important for everybody to know the responsibilities and have sort of multi-level strategies in place for how you deal with it. So on an organisation level, policies, training that is easily accessible to everybody and targeted at particular members of your workforce. From a leader, an individual leader working with the people that you engage with every day, it is about having a level of empathy and relationship there so that you can have these kinds of conversations and providing the sort of space in which that can happen as well. So,
yeah, but it's also, I think Australia has some national initiatives like Beyond Blue or Are You OK Day, emphasizing the importance of mental health awareness and support. So also on the government level, there is emphasis being put on this area.
Yes. Are You OK Day? Yeah, and I would call that out as well because it is unique to Australia and a really great initiative. Is a not-for-profit that sponsor essentially, basically promote an awareness day every year, which is where we basically are encouraged to say to one another, are you okay? And everyone is given a lot of resources for sort of managing your way through that conversation, which is essentially one of the underlying issues when we're talking about, say, that the largest traditional industries in Australia would be agriculture and resources and mining, both very male dominated and both ones where you have those persistent problems with people being unable to effectively have a supportive conversation about mental health. It's about providing somebody with that guidance to understand exactly what the expectation is and how you should respond to it, for example, because not everybody's really sure about that.
Yeah, I think you already reflected on how do you as a leader address these mental health and well-being issues within your organization. But could you still summarize, Reianna, what would you say is most important for the leaders to address these issues?
So I'm going to say that the most important thing I find is training. So I think there's an assumption that there's a level of knowledge about how to handle mental health and well-being issues in the workplace that isn't necessarily there, especially across kind of different industries. So it's about ensuring that you provide proper training. And then you mentioned earlier Beyond Blue as an organisation we have here in Australia. They provide a lot of resources that help workplaces to educate different members of their team in how to have an effective conversation about mental health and well-being at work. It's not something that anybody enjoys to do. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody. So it is about kind of creating that shared knowledge of this is my responsibility as an individual, because there is an individual responsibility as well if you are under pressure at work. There's actions that you should be considering taking yourself, but then also, as a leader, these are the ways that we support you to have conversations with people if you think an intervention is required, or if somebody comes to you, this is how you respond to it as well. So training plays a big part, and there are fortunately in Australia, we do have a lot of resources for that as well.
That's positive, and I think it's really important what you mentioned, that it is also individuals' responsibility. Of course, managers play a key role, and as well as the leaders, but it is also the individual's responsibility. If we move forward and look at the innovation and purpose-driven leadership and explore a bit Australia's role in innovation and also your contribution as a purpose-driven leader. You mentioned mining already. I think Australia is a leader in sectors like mining, technology, fintech, and agtech, with significant government support for innovation through grants and tax incentives. Also, what I saw, Australia ranks 5th in the Global Innovation Index for innovation outputs, reflecting a very strong culture of research and development. How do you see innovation shaping Australia's future, and what role do you play in that?
So, we have mentioned it a couple of times, but Australia is very reliant on traditional industries. So mining, agriculture. The economy is increasingly diversifying into other industries that you mentioned as well. We are actually, interestingly, that you were talking about the rate of research and development and investment in that in Australia. Internally, in Australia, there's a lot of commentary about, is that really enough? But it is reasonably high. And traditional industries as well, they're also pursuing sort of higher levels of sustainability all the time, and that naturally drives a lot of innovation and searching for newer solutions and better models of ideation and execution. So I'll focus on those last two parts, because that's actually, I think, one of the things that's shaping Australia's future is that part. So the model for ideation and execution, and it's also part of the role that I play in that as well. So probably two roles that I'd say for myself. Australia has a very tight, it's an employee-driven labour market, so we have 4% unemployment, which is actually up from where it was, and very diverse in terms of participation levels. So you'll have some people who are full-time engaged in the workforce, and then other people in more casual kind of engagement. And different levels of technical literacy across a lot of industries as well. So I think one of the roles, and I really enjoy this part of it, is helping businesses to more effectively manage the human resources that they have available to them at work. So this has benefits for both employees and employers as well, of course, because everybody wants to be basically deploying the resources they have to ultimate effect. And as an employee of a business as well, you want to make sure that you want to feel like your contribution is meaning something to the employer. And as I mentioned before, it's a highly regulated environment. So it can be a challenge for an employer without kind of the right tooling in place. So that's an important part of my purpose. As well as that, the culture of innovation. So I think we have a tendency potentially to think of innovation as a creative process. But or creative activity, but innovation is actually a process. So there's a method to ideation, and then the execution and understanding of those ideas and how you're actually going to turn them into solutions for the market. And that's also, so even sort of well-established project management and ideation frameworks like Agile, for example, which are pretty common in technology companies, not so much outside of industries where there's a lot of innovation. So, for example, there are a lot of government programs in Australia where they've started adopting Agile methods as a way of governing those projects, which is a new thing. And it's also fanning out across a lot of other industries. So like going to adopt some of these more process-driven innovation frameworks, sort of control the execution and the outcomes that we get. And so I also enjoy sort of mentoring people from other industries about how we've been doing that, obviously in technology for a long time.
And as you mentioned, the ideation is a process, but I think it's also for the many companies, and it's a way of working. There's continuous learnings, continuous development, so that you always look at how you can do things even better, or how you can improve, and how you can look at outside of the box and really think fresh on what you are doing.
Yeah,
maybe also kind of a mindset.
Yeah, and that's one of the great benefits of the huge amounts of diversity we have in Australia. You know, people from a lot of different backgrounds and countries and types of businesses. And then sort of without the right frameworks in place, it becomes very difficult to leverage that and get the right voices in the right places at the right times. So a good ideation framework will give you that ability to get the opinions that you need at the critical points in the process.
Do you have any advice you would give for other leaders aiming to embed purpose into their work and culture?
So purpose, there's lots of different ways in which purpose will impact the mission of a business. One of the ones, the one that I want to focus on is definition. So it's important to define the purpose, your purpose. So your purpose actually, as well as a business's purpose, and then the purpose of a group of people. So they're essentially going to be in some ways derivatives of the same thing. Personal purpose is actually an interesting one there, because if you're working with it for an organization and your personal purpose and the organization purpose are not well aligned, there's potentially a source of friction there. But one of the things I want to highlight about definition is that an organization will have a purpose. It is about defining that purpose in a way that resonates with the people that you are working with. So sort of taking the 10-word mission statement of a business and going, this is our purpose, everybody, is not really enough anymore. You have to create a narrative that helps somebody to understand what you are doing and what to contribute to the overall organization purpose, and why you are doing it as well. So I think that's one of the most important things for a leader to do well, and it's one of the words I think we shy away from a little bit as well. It's important to have a purpose and to share it in an inspiring way. So it's not just about kind of sharing the knowledge. It's about helping people to understand what you're doing, why we're doing it, and to feel inspired and connected to that as well.
That's very well said. And as you said, first understanding what is your purpose, and ideally as connecting with the company's purpose so that it's well aligned and articulating in a very inspiring way what the purpose is.
Yeah.
Hey, time is running. So if we take a few questions on the looking ahead and thinking of the future of work in Australia. As in many countries, also in Australia, there is a shift towards more flexible work arrangements post-pandemic. I think it's 30% of Australians working remotely at least part of the time. Also increasing focus on digital skills, with government programs aimed to upskill in the workforce to meet future demand. How has, Reianna, remote work changed your approach to leadership and team management? I know you're also working quite a lot remotely.
Yeah, I work 100% remotely, actually. And I work with a team where most of the people I work with work at least 60% remotely. But everybody is actually given the choice individually. And we are in a climate where there's a lot of kind of There is a lot of discussion about the merits and the pitfalls of remote work. I would have to say for myself, I am a staunch advocate of remote work. So especially when you're in a very tight labour market like what we have, if you're going to narrow yourself to looking for a very specific set of skills and I want them to be in a specific place and available at a specific time, you're really like the Venn diagram is getting very small, particularly in some industries. So you're not doing yourself any favours. And for, I think another thing that's important is I think we have a tendency to look at this conversation from a COVID or post-COVID perspective. I've been working in some remotely in some fashion and with distributed teams as well, at least in every state in Australia, but quite often with people overseas as well, for about 20 years. So in the technology space, it's been pretty common for a really long time. I love the fact that it offers a lot of opportunities to people who would traditionally struggle to participate in the workforce. So you've got people with disabilities who potentially aren't quite, especially, so if we go back to the start of that 20 years, like it was in some workplaces, were very difficult for people with disabilities to participate 100%. So now you've got that option available as well. And then you've just got more flexibility for people who can't participate in a full-time way as well, or during sort of the traditional core hours that people would be working, young parents, people in remote areas, etc. So, however, having said that, even with all of that background, I would be the first to acknowledge that 100% remote working is a real stress test for any kind of leader. Communication is difficult at times. Building and extending trust to people is always a challenge. Connecting with people is a well-noted challenge, of course. Staying outcome focused can be as well. I think actually one of the things about remote work is it's quite often considered to be less productive, but I also think that this is based on a false measurement of productivity. That's probably how I would sum it. As a leader, you have to put more energy into being intentional when you work remotely. So you have to document things. You have to prepare for the meetings. You have to know exactly what it is that you're going to go in and say. There's a higher level of administration across the board, and people are like, I'm just spending a lot more time than I used to doing administration. And I'm like, I feel like that's actually more of a reflection of the traditional office environment where we were potentially less intentional because you're all kind of, you're all trapped in the same physical space. So things like, for example, trust is famously what we feel like it's much easier to trust people in physical workplaces because we can see them. And I'm like, what does that prove about anything? So it's those sorts of things that are obviously stressed when you're aware of those perceptions and how you manage those things and the things that but there's a lot of tools and obviously in place.
Technology is helping definitely there, yes. But I think creating the sense of community, if you're not physically present, it's more challenging. And as you said, you need to be intentional. Reianna, what values do you believe will be crucial for the future workforce, and how are you preparing for them?
See, this is another one where you can pick lots and lots and lots of them because there's obviously lots of.
You pick the most important ones.
I'll pick the most important one. The most important one for me is adaptability, and I always say this one because I feel like adaptability is one of those things where it's assumed that people are naturally adaptable. So there are some people who are just not adaptable, and that's it. And I'm like, well, it's not a fixed number of neurons in people's heads. Adaptability is a skill, the same as many other skills, and it has to be built and nurtured. And it is a muscle that you have to exercise all the time, otherwise it will be gone. And so adaptability is less about, it is partially about sort of training people to understand what being adaptable at work looks like. But as well as that, it is about building a system that encourages adaptability. And it is very important for a leader and for an organization in general to encourage adaptability. I mean, it would be really unfair for an employer to not create kind of an environment where people feel comfortable with adaptation in the kind of business environment that we live in now, where things change all the time. Like you have technical innovations coming in all the time, wholesale changes to industry because of things like climate change, for example. So you have to kind of be doing the right thing to make sure that your employees and the people and stakeholders in your organization can always come on that journey with you. parts of adaptability that I always encourage people to focus on would be, it's what I hate this phrase because I feel like it's been stolen and misappropriated by lots of people, but a growth mindset is a good thing. Within my sort of context, I was trying to describe a growth mindset as being encouraging people to think of challenges and changes as not as threats, so as opportunities. So it doesn't have to be that you're continually focused on growth, which I think is kind of it's become permutated into that over time. It is about sort of looking at challenges and opportunities and changes and going, this is not a threat to me. And that is about environmental safety a lot of the time. So about encouraging people to share their ideas, to share their feedback, to be open with their communication about things, for example. And that's part of what creates an adaptable environment. Is the other thing I think, and this can be quite difficult for leaders as well, it is about sharing the right amount of information about the actual challenges of a situation as well. So I think historically there was a real reluctance to share kind of the real landscape within which we operate, but I feel like that's sort of slowly changing over time, is that we're more willing to share within a business the actual context of the challenges that we face and look for collective contributions for how we're going to solve it as a business as well.
Excellent. I was going to ask Reianna as one last question from you, 3 key takeaways, but I think you actually summarized that already by talking about the values. You mentioned the adaptability, and you talked about the growth mindset and the leaders also giving the right amount of information. Reianna, is there anything as a last guidance or as a last key takeaway that you'd like to share with the listeners?
It's probably about, a couple of years ago, I became interested in the phrase crisis of leadership. We've had a succession of probably not particularly inspiring political leaders in the last couple of decades in Australia, and that phrase would come up a lot. And I always wondered where it came from. And so then I went off to Google and I found the book, which is a book called Leadership from 1978. By a man called James McGregor Burns. And that was where the phrase came from. And I thought, that's very interesting. My immediate thought was, though, 1978, how applicable are any of these learnings going to be in 2024? But I actually found that a surprising number of them were. And I thought the key takeaway from me from that, and the one that I would share with everybody today, is I feel like leadership has kind of evolved to this, it has evolved, and rightly so, to a discipline with a lot of different parts to it. And in a modern business, there's a lot of parts to being a leader. But it's always good to reflect on sort of the core skills of a leader and what it is that people expect from you in a leadership role in any place, whether it's in work or in society in general. And, they're looking for some of the old traditional values that I think we've all moved away from, which is, calm focus, sort of an inspiring narrative, a cool head, for example. And a lot of the book that I read was about that, and it made me think, I think we maybe have a bit of a tendency to underemphasize that. I think in modern leadership, some of the kind of the original parts of the discipline.
Thank you so much, Reianna. And I think we will share the names of those books later in the comments. But thank you so much for joining this podcast. It's been very insightful to hear your thoughts and also your stories, also your guidance, the values you talked about was really, really insightful. So thank you once more, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I encourage all of you to reflect how you can incorporate purpose into your work and leadership style, and how you can make a difference and drive positive change in your work and also in your life. Thank you for joining, and tune in for the next episode. Thanks again, Reianna.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.